This video is created for storytelling while the real names, locations, and identifying information have been changed to protect the privacy and dignity of the individuals and families involved. Viewer discretion is advised.
Welcome back to the channel. If you're here late at night looking for a story to drift off to, you're in the right place. Before we begin, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. It was already 90 degrees by 10 in the morning when I turned onto Red Clay Road. Southern heat doesn't just sit on your skin, it presses. It climbs into your collar and settles there like a damp hand. I'd left my blazer in the car, but the tie still felt like a mistake. Sweat slid down my spine as I made my way from mailbox to mailbox, rehearsing my introduction in my head. Smile, offer scripture, ask if they found peace, accept rejection gracefully. Most mornings took 15 or 20 doors before anyone even cracked one open. The church assigned us to safe zones, that was the phrase. Certain neighborhoods were off limits due to crime statistics. I never knew how to feel about that. If salvation was universal, why were our maps color-coded? Red Clay Road wasn't dangerous, just forgotten. The houses sat far apart, sinking into wide patches of dry yard, rusted lawn chairs, faded wind chimes, a few satellite dishes angled stubbornly at the sky. 6 doors in, I reached the one that would stay with me. A sagging single-story house with chipped pale green paint and a rusted Ford pickup parked crooked in the driveway. The grass had grown in uneven patches, and a plastic tricycle lay on its side near the porch steps, sun-bleached and cracked. There were no other toys, no signs of recent life. Still, I climbed the steps and knocked. The door opened almost instantly. The woman who stood there looked as though gravity had been working overtime on her for decades. Her back curved forward sharply, and her thin white hair was pinned into a tight bun. Liver spots freckled her paper-thin skin, but her eyes were sharp, alert. "Well, aren't you a picture?" she said, smiling wide. "You must be roasting out there." Her voice carried a sweetness that felt practiced. "Yes, ma'am," I replied, forcing cheer into my tone. "Just stopping by to talk about—" "Oh, come inside first. You look like you're about to faint." A wave of cold air drifted past her from the dark interior. My body leaned toward it before my mind caught up. We were told never to refuse hospitality. "Thank you," I said. The smell hit me the moment I crossed the threshold. It wasn't one smell. It was layers. Sour milk, old cooking grease, something metallic beneath it all. The living room was wrapped in dark wood paneling that swallowed what little light filtered through the windows. A mustard-colored sofa slouched against a wall. Plastic covers clung to armchairs, yellowed with age. She shuffled toward the kitchen. "I'm Etta May," she called. "You can call me Miss Etta." "Jonah," I replied. My voice sounded smaller inside the house. I took a seat on the couch, careful not to sink too deeply into its cushions. The air conditioner hummed loudly, but it didn't cool the room evenly. Cold air brushed my ankles while the rest of me remained sticky with sweat. From somewhere deeper in the house, I heard a dull thump, then another. I sat up straighter. Miss Etta returned with a sweating glass of iced tea, the ice clinking against the sides. "Homemade," she said proudly. It was good, sweet enough to make my teeth ache. We exchanged pleasantries, weather, the drought, the price of groceries. I gradually steered the conversation toward faith, but she seemed more interested in studying me than in scripture. "You got family?" she asked. "Yes, ma'am." "Close?" "Yes." She nodded slowly, as if filing something away. Another thump sounded from somewhere above us. I glanced toward the ceiling. "You have someone else at home?" I asked. "My boy," she said. The word felt strange coming from someone her age. "He stays upstairs." There was a pause, a smile. He doesn't get out much. I imagined an adult son, maybe injured, maybe ill. I felt a flicker of purpose. This was why we knocked, to reach the ones hidden away. I'd be happy to speak with him too, I offered. Her eyes brightened in a way that unsettled me. Oh, he'd like that. He gets lonely. The metallic scent in the air seemed stronger now, or maybe I was just noticing it more. Miss Etta rose and motioned toward a narrow hallway. Come on, he's awake. I can tell. The hallway was dim, lined with framed photographs. I couldn't make out the faces clearly in the low light, but they appeared to be of the same boy at different ages. Each picture felt slightly off. In one, he looked 10, in another, 15, then suddenly much younger again. At the base of the staircase, I hesitated. The steps creaked under Miss Etta's weight as she climbed. For someone so hunched, she moved with surprising steadiness. Halfway up, I caught that metallic smell again, sharper now. Is he sick? I asked carefully. Oh, he's special, she replied. The word hung in the air. At the top of the stairs was a single closed door with a brass lock, locked from the outside. Miss Etta reached into her cardigan pocket and withdrew a small key. You'll have to forgive him. He doesn't always understand visitors. A slow scraping sound came from the other side of the door, then breathing. Heavy, too heavy. My heartbeat began to pound in my ears. Miss Etta? I started, unsure what I meant to say, but the key was already sliding into the lock. The click sounded too loud in the narrow hallway. From behind the door came a sudden shift in movement, something dragging across the floor, then a low, almost eager hum. Miss Etta's smile widened. He's been waiting, she whispered, and the door began to open. The door didn't swing open all at once. It eased inward slowly, like the room itself was deciding whether to reveal what it held. The first thing I noticed was the light. A harsh, fluorescent glare spilled into the hallway, making the dim wood-paneled walls behind us look even darker. Dust floated visibly in the beam. Then the smell intensified. Metallic, sour, stale air that hadn't moved in a long time. I forced myself not to step back. Miss Etta leaned close to the crack in the doorway. Caleb, she cooed softly, we have company. There was silence, then the slow scrape of something heavy shifting across the floor. My throat tightened. The door opened wider. The room looked nothing like I expected. It wasn't a typical bedroom. It felt staged, preserved in time. Pale blue walls painted with faded clouds, a bookshelf filled with children's storybooks, a twin bed tucked neatly in the corner, made with cartoon rocket ship sheets that had long since lost their color. But the person standing near the center of the room was unmistakably an adult man. He had to be at least 6 feet tall, broad shoulders, thick arms. His posture was hunched, but not frail like Miss Etta's. Tense, guarded. His hair was unevenly cut, as if trimmed at home without a mirror. He wore loose gray sweatpants and an oversized t-shirt that hung awkwardly on his frame. And his eyes, they were fixed on me, unblinking. The heavy breathing I'd heard was his. Caleb, Miss Etta repeated sweetly, this young man came to talk about God. He didn't respond. He just stared. There was something deeply unsettling about the stillness. Not aggression exactly, just an intensity that felt wrong for the silence of the room. I swallowed and forced a polite smile. Hi, Caleb. I'm Jonah. No reaction. His fingers twitched slightly at his sides. Miss Etta gave my back a gentle push. Go on in, don't be shy. I stepped over the threshold. The air inside the room was colder than the hallway. A window unit hummed loudly, but the blinds were nailed shut. I noticed the nails immediately. Nailed? Why would you nail blinds shut? Behind me, the door clicked closed. I turned instinctively. Miss Etta was no longer in the doorway. The lock turned. From the outside, my stomach dropped. I forced a laugh. Miss Etta? No answer. The fluorescent light above flickered once, then steadied. Caleb's head tilted slightly, studying me like a specimen. It's okay, I said, though I wasn't sure who I was reassuring. I just want to talk. He took one step forward. The floor groaned under his weight. Up close, I noticed faint scars on his forearms, thin white lines crossing over each other. Old, not fresh. My pulse quickened. I come by neighborhoods to share scripture. If you'd like, we could pray together. His lips parted. For a second, I thought he might speak. Instead, he let out a low humming sound, almost like he was testing his voice. I glanced around the room more carefully now. There was no desk, no phone, no computer, no television, just toys, not scattered randomly, lined up, carefully arranged on shelves, plastic trucks, building blocks, action figures, all spotless. The metallic smell seemed to be coming from somewhere near the bed. Caleb took another step toward me. I held up my hands instinctively. You don't have to come closer. He stopped. His breathing grew louder. I'm not here to hurt you, I added quickly. At that, something shifted in his expression. A flicker. Recognition? Confusion. He spoke suddenly. Not loudly, not clearly, but unmistakably words. Don't leave. The sound of his voice startled me more than his silence had. I'm not leaving, I lied. From outside the door, I heard Miss Etta's voice, faint but firm. Be nice, Caleb. The tone wasn't sweet anymore. It was commanding. Caleb flinched. His gaze darted briefly toward the door, then back to me. Do you go outside? I asked carefully. His eyes flickered again. Used to, he muttered. My chest tightened. Used to. The nails in the blinds, the lock on the door, the preserved childhood room. This wasn't just shelter. It was confinement. How long have you lived in this room? I asked before I could stop myself. His jaw tightened. The humming returned, louder now, almost drowning out the air conditioner. Miss Etta, I called toward the door. Can you unlock this? Silence. Caleb stepped closer again, close enough now that I could feel the heat radiating from him despite the cold air. You're not like the others, he said suddenly. My skin prickled. The others? He stared at me, as if weighing whether to answer. They run, he whispered. A chill crawled up my spine. I forced calm in my voice. I'm not running. The doorknob rattled once from the outside. A warning. Caleb's breathing grew uneven. I can't, he said, his voice trembling now. Can't what? Can't let you. My heart pounded so loudly I thought he could hear it. He reached out suddenly and grabbed my wrist. His grip was strong, painfully strong, but not violent, desperate. Don't make her mad, he whispered urgently. That's when I understood. This wasn't a trap meant for me. It was a prison meant for him, and I had just walked into it. From the other side of the door, Miss Etta's voice floated in, sharp as broken glass. Caleb! His fingers tightened around my wrist. You have to stay, He breathed urgently. The lock turned again, this time slowly, deliberately, and I realized with sick certainty that whatever role I had stepped into, I had not been invited as a guest. I had been selected. The door began to open. The door opened just enough for Miss Etta's face to appear in the crack. Her expression had changed. The sweetness was gone. In its place was something harder, measured. "Caleb," she said calmly, "let go." His grip on my wrist tightened instead. I tried to keep my voice steady. "Miss Etta, I think there's been a misunderstanding. I should be going." "You'll go when I say you can go," she replied. The words were quiet, but absolute. The door opened wider, though she didn't step fully into the room. She stayed in the hallway, one hand on the doorknob, as if she were controlling the oxygen supply to the space. "Caleb doesn't like it when people leave," she continued. "It upsets him." Caleb's breathing grew ragged. His fingers trembled against my skin. "You told him to hold me here," I said. Her eyes shifted to mine. "I told him not to let another one run." "Another one?" The phrase landed heavily. "How many?" I asked before I could stop myself. Her lips curved into something that might have been a smile once. "Not many, just boys like you, always knocking, always promising something better." Caleb made a small sound, almost like a wounded animal. "They leave," she went on. "They always leave." "I wasn't planning to stay," I said carefully, "but I'm not here to hurt anyone." Miss Etta finally stepped into the room. Up close, I could see that her hunched posture didn't slow her at all. She moved with deliberate control. "You come in here talking about salvation, about freedom, about God having a plan." Her gaze flicked toward the nailed-shut blinds. "You know what happens when he believes you." Caleb's grip loosened slightly, but he didn't release me. "He tries to go outside," I said. My stomach turned. "You lock him in," I whispered. "I protect him," she corrected sharply. "From what? From the world? Or from yourself?" The metallic smell in the room suddenly made sense. Not blood, not decay. Old metal. Restraints. I noticed now, half hidden beneath the bed frame, the faint outline of a chain bolted to the floor. Rusted, unused recently, but there. My throat tightened. "You can't keep him here," I said. Miss Etta laughed softly. "And you can't take him." "I wasn't trying to take him anywhere." "But you would. You fill their heads with ideas." Caleb's breathing grew frantic. "I don't want to make her mad," he muttered. "I know," I said gently. He looked at me, eyes wide, conflicted. "Caleb," I said carefully, ignoring Miss Etta for the moment, "do you want to leave this room?" Silence. Miss Etta's jaw tightened. "Answer him," she ordered. Caleb flinched. "I don't know," he whispered finally. That answer hit harder than anything else. He didn't know. When you cage someone long enough, the outside becomes terrifying. Miss Etta stepped closer to us. "You see, he's safe here." "Safe isn't the same as free," I replied. Her eyes flashed. "Freedom almost killed him." I froze. "What happened?" I asked quietly. She hesitated. For the first time since I'd met her, something like uncertainty crossed her face. "He wandered, years ago, followed some boys down to the highway, didn't understand the traffic, didn't understand people laughing at him." Caleb's breathing trembled again. "They hurt him," she finished. The scars on his arms suddenly felt heavier in my memory. "And you decided the world was the enemy," I said. "I decided he wouldn't suffer again." There it was, not malice, fear, weaponized. Locking him away isn't protection, it's punishment for something he didn't do. Miss Etta's expression hardened again. "You don't understand." "I right. I don't understand what it's like to be afraid every day that the world will hurt someone you love." Her breathing slowed. "But this?" I gestured around the room. "This hurts him too." Caleb's fingers finally slipped from my wrist. He looked between us like a child caught between parents arguing. "I don't want to make you mad," he said to his grandmother. "I'm not mad," she replied, though her voice was tight. "Yes, you are." The room went quiet. The fluorescent light buzzed overhead. Miss Etta looked smaller suddenly, not physically, but emotionally, as if the weight she carried had finally shown itself. "He's all I have," she said, almost to herself. "And you're all he has." We stood there in that artificial cold, the three of us suspended in something that felt less like horror and more like a crossroads. "Unlock the door," I said gently. "Let me leave and let him decide if he wants to step outside with me, just onto the porch, nothing more." She stared at me for a long time, then at Caleb. "You'd come back?" she asked him. Caleb hesitated, then nodded slowly. "I'll come back." The answer seemed to fracture something inside her. After a long moment, she stepped into the hallway. The lock turned. The door opened fully. I moved slowly toward it, resisting every instinct to bolt. Caleb followed a step behind me. At the top of the stairs, he paused. The sunlight from a downstairs window reached just barely into the hallway, touching the edge of his bare foot. He looked at it like it was something sacred. "You don't have to," I said quietly. He swallowed, then stepped forward. We descended together. Miss Etta watched from the hallway above. When we reached the front door, I opened it slowly. Heat rushed in. Real air. Caleb shielded his eyes at first, then he stepped onto the porch. The world did not end. No one laughed, no one pointed. The only sound was cicadas humming in the trees. He stood there breathing deeply like a man surfacing from underwater. After a minute, he looked back at the house. "I'll come back," he said again. Miss Etta's silhouette shifted in the upstairs window. I didn't stay long after that. I walked down Red Clay Road without running this time. My legs were still shaky, but my mind felt clearer than it had in years. I never reported them, not because I was afraid, but because what I had seen wasn't simple evil. It was fear twisted into control, a cage built out of love and terror. When people now ask about the strangest experience I ever had going door to door, I don't tell them about demons or monsters. I tell them about a boy who had forgotten what sunlight felt like, and about a grandmother who loved him so much she nearly smothered him with it. Some houses don't hide evil, they hide fear. And sometimes the door you knock on isn't the one that needs opening. The town of Port Isabel, Texas sits low and flat against the Gulf, the kind of place where secrets drift as slowly as the tide. It was there, on November 3rd, 1915, that Daniel Rivera was born. By the time he was 15, Daniel had already learned that charm could take you further than honesty. He was quick with a smile, quicker with excuses, and always looking for a shortcut. At 16, he was arrested for breaking into a hardware store with two older boys. They took the blame for most of it, but Daniel still spent 6 months in a juvenile facility. He came out quieter, watchful. Whatever conscience he had seemed dulled. In 1933, after his father lost his job at the docks, the Riveras moved to Seville, Spain, to live near relatives. The relocation gave Daniel a clean slate. By 19, he was working on his uncle's citrus farm outside the city. He married a local girl, Elena Morales, and within a few years they had 3 children. On paper, Daniel was respectable, husband, father, provider. But restlessness simmered under the surface. When World War II reshaped Europe, Daniel joined Spain's merchant marine. The sea offered anonymity and the thrill of new ports. In Lisbon and Marseille, he discovered how easy it was to reinvent himself. He told women he was a shipping magnate's son, a diplomat's assistant, a widower, whatever fit the room. He learned to read loneliness the way sailors read weather. During one Atlantic crossing in 1942, a cargo hatch slipped loose in rough waters and struck him across the head. He was knocked unconscious and spent weeks in the infirmary of a British vessel that rescued their crew. The injury left a jagged scar above his temple and, according to doctors, a fracture that affected the frontal lobe. Afterwards, something in him shifted. He became more impulsive, less restrained. If guilt ever stirred, it did not linger. By 1945, Daniel had secured passage back to the United States, leaving Elena and the children in Spain with vague promises of sending money. He arrived in Mobile, Alabama, with a single suitcase and no intention of returning to his former life. His first months back were unremarkable. Odd jobs, boarding houses, short-term schemes. He was arrested again, this time for attempting to sell stolen ration coupons. A brief prison sentence introduced him to a cellmate named Lucien Baptiste, a Haitian immigrant who spoke softly about fate, spirits, and personal magnetism. Lucien insisted that belief shaped reality. If Daniel believed he was irresistible, others would see it too. Daniel listened. When he was released in 1946, he carried with him a new conviction. He was destined for more. He began scanning the back pages of newspapers, especially the Lonely Hearts columns. In the years before modern matchmaking, these ads were raw with longing. Refined widow, 52, financially secure, seeks gentleman for companionship. Devout Christian woman, 47, owns home, desires marriage-minded suitor. Daniel saw not romance, but opportunity. He crafted letters in careful script, presenting himself as a successful importer of textiles recently returned from Europe. He wrote about sunsets over the Mediterranean, about grief for a wife lost to illness, about his desire for a simple American life. He tailored each story to the woman reading it. Checks began arriving, small loans to cover travel expenses, gifts sent to boarding houses under false names. When he visited in person, he was attentive, affectionate, and deliberate. He knew how to hold a hand just long enough, how to lower his voice when speaking of the future. For a while, theft was enough. That same year, hundreds of miles away, in the small town of Pine Bluff, Arkansas, Clara Whittemore was fighting a different kind of loneliness. Clara had been born in 1920, the only child of a domineering mother who measured worth in appearances. Clara developed early and struggled with her weight throughout childhood. Classmates mocked her. Her mother criticized her relentlessly. By 10, she had learned to shrink herself in conversations, to apologize for taking up space. Her home life offered little refuge. An older cousin who lived with them for a summer crossed boundaries that should never be crossed. When Clara tearfully confided in her mother, she was accused of lying and punished for seeking attention. The lesson was clear. Her pain did not matter. She poured herself into school instead. Books were orderly, predictable. She graduated near the top of her class and enrolled in a nursing program in Little Rock. Academically, she excelled. Socially, she remained awkward and painfully self-conscious. Hospitals, however, did not judge appearances the way townspeople did. Clara found work first as a surgical assistant, later as a nurse in a veterans ward after the war. She was competent, efficient, and emotionally detached in a way that supervisors appreciated. But nights were harder. She longed for affection with an intensity that embarrassed her. She dated sporadically, often men who seemed kind at first but grew distant. At 24, she became pregnant after a brief relationship with a traveling salesman. When she told him, he denied paternity and disappeared. Humiliated, Clara returned to Pine Bluff to give birth to a daughter, whom she named Lillian. To avoid scandal, she invented a story about a husband killed overseas. The town sympathized. Pity, she discovered, was easier to bear than scorn. A year later, she married a bus mechanic named Harold Whittemore. Within months, she was pregnant again. The marriage unraveled as quickly as it began. Harold resented Lillian, drank heavily, and accused Clara of trapping him. They divorced before their son, Michael, turned 1. By 1947, Clara was back in Little Rock, working double shifts as a nurse supervisor, while her children stayed with a church-run boarding home during the week. She told herself it was temporary. She needed stability before she could provide them one. It was a co-worker's joke that changed everything. One afternoon, a folded newspaper clipping appeared in her locker. Circled in red was the address for Heart and Home Matrimonials, a mail-order introduction service. For serious individuals seeking marriage, it read. Clara flushed with embarrassment, then anger. But that night, alone in her rented room, she unfolded the clipping again. She told herself she was only curious. She sent in a brief description of herself, omitting her children. Weeks later, a letter arrived. Dear Miss Whittemore, it began, your words spoke to a solitude I know too well. The letter was from Daniel Rivera of Mobile, Alabama. He described himself as a widower, financially stable, weary of transient company and seeking permanence. His tone was warm without being crude. He wrote about wanting laughter in his home again. Clara read the letter 3 times before sleeping with it under her pillow. Their correspondence intensified quickly. Daniel's letters arrived thick with promises. He spoke of purchasing a small property in the north, of building a life free from judgment. He never asked directly for money, but mentioned temporary business setbacks. Clara offered to help, small amounts at first, then more. When Daniel finally suggested a visit, Clara hesitated. She confessed she had 2 children. His reply was swift and reassuring. He wrote, "Children are blessings. We will build a family together." He did not mean it. Their first meeting in person was electric for Clara and calculated for Daniel. He was not as wealthy as he had implied, but he was handsome in a worn, foreign way. He listened intently when she spoke. He touched her elbow lightly as they crossed streets. Within days, he suggested that life would be simpler if she left the children temporarily in professional care while they established themselves. Just until we're settled, then we bring them home, he said. Clara agreed. On a gray morning in January 1948, she left Lillian and Michael at a Salvation Mission residence in Memphis, promising to return within weeks. She did not know that this decision would bind her to a man who saw people not as companions, but as stepping stones. Daniel had found not only a new partner, but an accomplice waiting to be shaped. And the Lonely Hearts column still waited in the back pages of newspapers across America. When Clara stepped off the train in Memphis after leaving her children at the mission residence, she felt hollowed out. Daniel noticed the tremor in her hands but said nothing. Instead, he wrapped his coat around her shoulders and told her they were starting fresh, a new city, a new life, no judgment. For Daniel, the arrangement was ideal. Clara had medical training, a steady demeanor, and a willingness to bend reality for love. More importantly, she needed him. That dependence made her predictable. They rented a modest apartment in Queens, New York, under the name Mr. and Mrs. Rivera. Daniel explained that maintaining appearances was essential for business. Clara did not question it. She had already crossed lines she once believed sacred. One evening, over cheap wine at their kitchen table, Daniel decided to be honest, or at least selectively so. He told her about the women he had courted through newspaper ads, the widows who mailed travel money, the spinsters who handed over savings bonds, the lonely landowners who believed marriage to a cultured European would elevate their status. He framed it as necessity. They weren't hurt, he insisted, just embarrassed. Clara should have recoiled. Instead, she rationalized. The world had never been kind to her. Why should she be loyal to its rules? Daniel refined the operation. He placed new ads in papers across the Northeast and Midwest. World-traveled gentleman, 38, financially secure, seeks sincere lady for marriage. Responses poured in. Daniel answered each letter carefully, assessing not just vulnerability, but assets. Did she own property? Was she recently widowed? Did she live alone? Clara's role was strategic. She posed as Daniel's sister when propriety demanded it, or as a widowed sister-in-law when a softer touch was required. Her presence reassured potential victims. A man endorsed by family seemed trustworthy. Their first major target together was Evelyn Harper, a 63-year-old widow from Trenton, New Jersey. Evelyn owned a small row house and had recently sold her late husband's auto shop. She invited Daniel to visit after weeks of letters filled with promises of companionship. Clara accompanied him. Evelyn was cautious at first. She eyed Clara with suspicion until Daniel spun a story about family loyalty and shared grief. Within days, Evelyn was cooking for them, discussing renovations to their future home. Clara watched as Daniel slid into Evelyn's routines. He handled her finances under the pretext of helping manage investments. He convinced her to liquidate certain accounts to fund a supposed import venture. When the money was transferred, Daniel grew distant. Clara expected they would simply leave, as they had before, but this time was different. Evelyn confronted Daniel one night after discovering irregularities in her bank statements. Voices rose, accusations flew. Clara stood frozen in the doorway as Evelyn threatened to contact the police. What happened next unfolded quickly. Daniel grabbed Evelyn by the wrists, attempting to calm her. She fought harder than either of them anticipated. In the struggle, she fell, striking her head against the corner of a heavy oak table. The sound was sharp, final. Silence followed. Clara knelt beside the older woman, checking for a pulse. There was none. Daniel's face hardened, not with grief, but calculation. This was an accident, and accidents can be managed. They buried Evelyn in the narrow crawl space beneath her own house that night. Clara used tools from the shed with clinical detachment. Years of assisting in surgeries had dulled her sensitivity to the physical realities of death. She told herself they had no choice, that panic had dictated the outcome. They left Trenton before sunrise with several $1,000s and a suitcase of jewelry. The line had been crossed. After Evelyn, the dynamic between them shifted. Daniel began to see Clara not as fragile, but capable. Clara, in turn, became fiercely possessive. She tolerated Daniel's flirtations with targets, but jealousy simmered beneath the surface. Their next confirmed victim was Margaret Sloan in Albany, New York. Margaret was 55, childless and eager for affection. Daniel courted her for months before proposing marriage in a small civil ceremony. Clara attended as his cousin. Margaret transferred the deed of her home into joint ownership within weeks. Clara watched the intimacy between Margaret and Daniel with mounting resentment. She had given up her children for him. She had risked everything, yet she remained the hidden partner. The breaking point came when Clara walked into the bedroom one afternoon and found Margaret laughing with Daniel, her hand resting on his chest. Later that evening, Clara confronted him. "You don't need to touch them like that," she said, her voice low. "They have to believe it," he replied. The argument escalated. Margaret overheard raised voices and entered the room, demanding an explanation. Daniel attempted to defuse the situation, but Clara's jealousy erupted. She struck Margaret with a brass candlestick from the bedside table. The blow stunned, but did not kill her. Daniel reacted without hesitation. He wrapped his hands around Margaret's throat and held tight, while Clara stood rigid, watching the life drain from the woman's eyes. This time, there was no pretense of accident. They staged Margaret's disappearance, telling neighbors she had traveled to visit relatives. They sold furnishings, liquidated accounts, and vanished before suspicions solidified. By 1949, the pair had targeted multiple women across New York, Michigan, and Pennsylvania. Some were simply robbed and abandoned, others were not as fortunate. Rumors began to circulate in small towns about a smooth-talking widower and his stern female relative. In Grand Rapids, Michigan, they encountered Lillian Moore, a 42-year-old recently widowed mother of a toddler named Annie. Lillian invited them to stay in her modest home while Daniel finalized business matters in town. Annie's presence irritated Clara from the start. The child's crying grated on her nerves, stirring memories she preferred buried. One evening, Lillian grew suspicious after seeing Daniel without the toupee he usually wore. Confrontation followed. Clara, drawing on her medical background, offered Lillian sedatives to calm her nerves. Whether from trust or fear, Lillian swallowed the pills. Annie began to cry when her mother slumped in her chair. Clara snapped. She lifted the child, hissing for silence. The crying intensified. In a moment of blind rage, she pressed a pillow over Annie's face until the sound stopped. Daniel stared at her stunned. "You've made this worse," he said. "What choice do we have now?" she shot back. They shot Lillian while she was unconscious and disposed of both bodies in a shallow grave behind the property. But this time, they were careless. Neighbors noticed their sudden departure. Lillian's sister reported her missing. Investigators began connecting threads, similar descriptions, similar patterns. A man with a foreign accent, a plain, heavy-set woman at his side. The press started using the phrase that would follow them forever, the matrimonial killers. Back in New York, detectives reopened Evelyn Harper's file after receiving a tip about a couple matching Daniel and Clara's description. A search of the Trenton property revealed disturbed earth beneath the house. The net tightened. In February 1950, police traced the pair to a boarding house in Brooklyn. Officers knocked just after dawn. Daniel opened the door, composed as ever. Clara stood behind him, pale but steady. They were arrested without resistance. During interrogation, Daniel attempted to minimize Clara's role. Clara, in turn, insisted she acted out of devotion. Each blamed circumstances. Neither expressed remorse. Prosecutors in New York moved quickly. Unlike Michigan, the state still enforced capital punishment. They chose to try the couple for Margaret Sloane's murder, the evidence for which was strongest. As the trial date approached, letters from the public flooded the courthouse. Some condemned them as monsters, others fixated morbidly on their romance. In their separate cells, Daniel and Clara continued writing to each other. The content was not about strategy or regret, it was about love. The courtroom would soon decide their fate, but long before the verdict, the damage had been done. A trail of broken families stretched across state lines, bound together by two people who had mistaken obsession for devotion and greed for survival. The courtroom in White Plains, New York, was packed long before the trial began. Reporters filled the first two rows, notebooks open, cameras ready. Housewives, students, and curious onlookers lined the benches behind them. Everyone wanted to see the couple the newspapers had christened the matrimonial killers. Daniel Rivera entered first, neatly dressed in a dark suit provided by his attorney. The scar above his temple was faint but visible beneath the courtroom lights. He carried himself with controlled composure, nodding politely as if attending a business meeting rather than a murder trial. Clara Whitmore followed, heavier than the photographs printed in the papers, her hair pulled back tightly. She avoided the crowd's gaze and looked only for Daniel. When their eyes met, she managed a small, almost relieved smile. They were charged with the murder of Margaret Sloane in Albany. Though authorities suspected them in multiple deaths across several states, New York prosecutors focused on the case with the strongest physical evidence. The states still imposed the death penalty. That fact alone shaped the strategy. The prosecution laid out its argument methodically. Daniel, they said, had crafted a calculated scheme to exploit lonely women through matrimonial advertisements. Clara had willingly assisted him. What began as fraud escalated to homicide when victims threatened exposure. Margaret Sloane's death, they argued, was no crime of passion. It was a deliberate act to preserve a lucrative con. Witnesses testified about Daniel's letters, flowery promises, declarations of devotion, pledges of financial stability. The letters were read aloud in court, stripped of romance and reframed as tools of manipulation. Neighbors from Albany described heated arguments coming from Margaret's home shortly before her disappearance. A bank clerk testified about large withdrawals made after Daniel gained access to Margaret's accounts. A forensic expert explained how injuries found on Margaret's exhumed body were consistent with blunt force trauma followed by strangulation. When it was Clara's turn to be implicated directly, the courtroom grew tense. The prosecution painted her not as a passive accomplice, but as a volatile force driven by jealousy. They suggested that her resentment toward Daniel's intimacy with victims often triggered the violence. The image they constructed was stark: Daniel the predator, Clara the enforcer. The defense countered with a different narrative. Daniel's attorney emphasized the head injury he sustained years earlier aboard a merchant vessel. Medical testimony described potential damage to impulse control and moral reasoning. They argued that the accident altered his personality and diminished his capacity for judgment. Clara's lawyer focused on her background, the humiliation she endured as a child, the trauma she carried into adulthood, her desperate search for affection. He portrayed her as emotionally fragile, dominated by a charismatic man who preyed on her vulnerabilities as much as he preyed on others. When Clara took the stand, her voice trembled at first, but steadied as she spoke about Daniel. "I loved him," she said plainly. "I gave up everything for him, my children, my job, my home." The prosecutor asked if love justified murder. "No," she replied after a long pause, "but when you believe someone is all you have, you stop seeing clearly." Daniel declined to testify. His attorneys believed his composure might crack under cross-examination. Instead, he sat motionless, occasionally glancing toward Clara when she spoke. The trial lasted 3 weeks. By the end, the jury had heard enough letters, financial records, and witness accounts to see a consistent pattern. Whatever sympathy existed for their troubled pasts was eclipsed by the deliberate nature of Margaret Sloane's death. After 8 hours of deliberation, the jury returned. Guilty. The judge imposed the sentence required by law: death by electric chair. There was an audible murmur in the courtroom. Clara closed her eyes briefly. Daniel remained still, jaw set, as though the verdict confirmed something he had anticipated all along. They were transferred to Sing Sing Correctional Facility in Ossining, New York. The death house was stark and regimented. Cells were small, conversations were limited. Yet Daniel and Clara found ways to communicate through letters passed by guards. Their correspondence did not dwell on appeals or legal arguments. Instead, they wrote about memory, the first train ride they took together, the night they watched snow fall from the apartment window in Queens, the way he held her hand before meeting a new target. Psychiatrists who evaluated them in prison noted an unsettling dynamic. Neither expressed sustained remorse for the victims. Their emotional energy remained directed toward each other. Public fascination intensified as the execution date approached. Newspapers speculated about their final statements. Editorials debated whether they were cold-blooded killers or tragic figures shaped by circumstance. The term love-crazed murderers appeared more than once. On March 8, 1951, the executions were scheduled. Clara went first. Witnesses described her as pale but composed. She declined a final meal and instead requested to see Daniel one last time. The request was denied. Strapped into the chair, she addressed the small group gathered to observe. "I loved him," she said plainly. "That is the truth of my life. Whatever else you believe about me, know that." Moments later, the current was applied. It was over within minutes. Daniel followed shortly after. He walked to the chamber without resistance. When asked if he had final words, he looked directly at the witnesses. "You speak of crime," he said evenly, "but none of you understand what it is to live without attachment. I found mine." He did not elaborate. The switch was thrown. In death, as in life, their identities remained intertwined. Their bodies were buried in separate graves, yet headlines continued to pair their names for decades. Investigators in other states quietly closed several unsolved cases, unable to conclusively tie them to Daniel and Clara, but unwilling to ignore the similarities. Families of suspected victims were left with partial answers at best. In the years that followed, books and films drew inspiration from their story. Screenwriters emphasized the twisted romance, directors focused on obsession. Audiences debated whether the relationship was genuine love or mutual dependence fueled by greed and insecurity. What remained undeniable was the pattern. Daniel identified vulnerability and exploited it. Clara surrendered her moral compass to maintain connection. Together, they amplified each other's worst instincts. Their crimes were not spontaneous bursts of violence. They were the result of incremental decisions, each lie easier than the last, each rationalization stronger, each step further from the lives they might have lived. The Lonely Hearts columns that once served as their hunting ground did not disappear, but for many readers, they carried a new shadow. Trust became harder. Letters were read with greater caution. In the end, Daniel Rivera and Clara Whitmore were not legends. They were two damaged individuals who built a partnership on deception and fed it with envy, greed, and obsession. Their story endures not because it is romantic, but because it exposes how easily longing can be manipulated and how quickly devotion can curdle into destruction. And in quiet towns across the country, widows and dreamers learned to hesitate before answering strangers who promised forever in neat, confident handwriting.